thank you to everyone who's here today and who's really helped make this this event such a success. I just feel like I'm jazzed up about thinking about what the next step is. And we're really intending this conference to kick off new partnerships, new activities, new initiatives. In fact, when NASA funded their component of the support for this event, it came along with support for 3 follow-up workshops next year. So as we move into this closing panel, I want to just sort of like share my perspective that we're really not closing. Maybe we're closing a day or two of engagement, but really what I see is thinking about the future and what's the right way to launch into meeting the needs and bridging the gaps that have been identified across so many exciting talks this over the past 2 days. So to wrap us up, we really have a fantastic lineup of speakers. First, we'll be hearing from Ben Saydah, who is the Global Market Strategist Lead for BP, based in Chicago, where BP America is based. Ben has actually been kind of part of the DNA of this conference for a long time because, as I mentioned when we launched this conference yesterday, that I do a lot of work with satellite data and I do a lot of work with energy, but it was only really when talking to Ben that it was clear that these 2 threads had so much overlap and connection. Following Ben, we'll have Sheldon Drobot, who is the mission area lead for environmental intelligence and sustainability at Ball Aerospace. And, with my satellite hat on, I'll say that the air quality and health and research community is so excited about a new generation of satellites that are coming out, including the Tempo satellite and Methane Sat and the GEMS instrument over Asia. And all of these are Ball Aerospace products. So actually it was Ben who engaged Sheldon in this conference. And I was like, we have Ball Aerospace coming? Like, that's amazing. That's awesome. And then our last speaker in today's lineup is Paul Grogan, who is a professor at Stevens Institute for Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey, a beautiful campus if you've never been there, in the School of Systems and Enterprise. And Paul, his work is thinking about how should satellite systems be designed to meet information needs, to meet the needs of researchers, of scientists, of energy companies, of public stakeholders. And so I think this question about knowing where there are needs and knowing where there is capability and knowing where there are unmet connections, how can we move forward? So that is our star-studded lineup to wrap us up. We will, as always, have quite a bit of time for Q&A, and I hope that you can be thinking about questions either that you haven't gotten answered over today that are cross-cutting, or even that might help us think about next steps for the future. So with that, Ben, thank you very much.
Thank you for that warm introduction. So I wanted to sort of shift gears a little bit from some of the prior presentations with what I'm going to talk about and talk more about the way we at BP use satellites to do real-time energy forecasting as opposed to looking at longer wavelength opportunities to look at planning or impacts over multi-years. So a bit of a background as far as where I sit in the BP organization. I'm in the trading arm of BP. So out of the Chicago office, we trade all of our oil and refined products. We also trade all of the low carbon products, things like carbon emissions, ethanol, all of that out of the Chicago office, and that's the group that I'm in. So what I've got on the screen here is really just a cartoon of the entire energy value chain that we're operating in. So everything from oil production to how that oil is shipped to oil refineries, refined in oil refineries, and then ultimately goes to the consumer as a product that they consumed either in transportation or in the production of plastics. Associated with that, there's concerns around foreign exchange and metals that we also trade, because those have an impact on our business. And then we also have now, with the advancement of biofuels, moved into trading agricultural products along with the carbon emissions and things like the renewable fuels credit that was alluded to in the last piece. So currently, we're trying to use satellites and other information to basically gain an understanding of where there's gaps or changes in this supply chain so that we can put oil and products into the customer's hands in the right part of the world. And so how do we actually do that to some extent? So the cartoon on the right here really just shows a supply and demand balance. And basically that's what we try and do in my organization as the Strategist organization. We're ultimately trying to forecast where is supply and demand, where are there imbalances, both on a global level, on a regional level, and then on a sub-regional level. So we do that at different points across from crude oil to the end user. So within crude oil, we're ultimately very interested in where is production coming online. We found opportunities to use satellite imagery to understand where new production is coming on. With satellite images, you can understand when a production well is going into service, and then use different regressions and forecasting to try and understand how that production will make it to market and when it'll be. And you can use that to then understand where there will be length and where oil needs to move. Also related to oil production and across actually the whole supply chain, weather is a big factor, and understanding weather and the sort of historic nature of satellites is key to that. We also, there's several providers out there currently that will give you inventory levels. So they'll take daily images of tanks across the world using SAR technology and can tell you what the inventories are. At different parts of the world, you have inventory truth data coming out. So the Department of Energy, for example, in the US will publish inventory data on a weekly basis. Other parts of the world is monthly. Other parts of the world is even less frequent than that. But that gives you an opportunity to test that satellite data or our internal estimates against truth data. Understanding where that is, understands where there's an imbalance, creates the opportunity to move products to where the world needs it, and or for entrepreneurial trading to see opportunities there. Around refineries and product supplied. So refineries are the consumer of crude oil, produce the products that people use in the world. Also around renewable diesel and ethanol, you can use satellite data to understand, is a facility operating? There's thermal data that you can get from satellites. There's flare data you can get from satellites, tells you whether a refinery or a production facility is on or off. And you can also use satellite data to understand what is happening at a site. So how many cars are on site? Maybe that's an indication of when someone's going into maintenance and changing their production profile. Is someone building a capital project? Can you look at the construction of that capital project and understand where they are on the cycle of that? If they say they're going to start up in 2022 and they don't have the ground disturbed yet, you can say, well, they're not going to start up in 2022 if it's 6 months out. So great opportunities there. And then again, you can look at inventory levels. And then finally, when you look at the end user, so the ultimate consumer is someone who's typically doing something where they're driving. It's either truck transport or car transport. That's the biggest consumer of crude oil derivatives out there. And so what is happening in the world? Are there changes in traffic patterns? Are there changes in urbanization? Are there things like that that'll change the ultimate demand, which will move where consumption is going to be and what is that rate of consumption? Other things that consume energy products around plastics and things like that. Is there something you can tell from satellite data to try and understand where in the world plastics are being consumed or produced and how that's going to impact the ultimate energy market? So really what we're trying to do is create a opportunity to find out where supply and demand is essentially before the market. And satellite data gives us the ability to look through basically cross-cut around the world in real time and generate that insight. And it's really an exciting field. And one of the reasons I was so energized when Tracy and I spoke about it is there's very few ways that you can actually get a global picture. Ultimately, you'll be able to get it in real time with granular data to really establish some of these insights. And it's both, all the talks have led up to this to talk about the ways we're using it. And this is just, I wanted to show a different application of it. And then just to try and sort of, talk about what it is that we really value. We do value things with a good historical data set that we can regress against, good interfaces that we can collect the data by, trying to get something that's as granular as possible. So And then also something with a frequent revisit time, because we are trying to do things on a weekly or sub-weekly basis. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Sheldon.
Well, I'm really glad to be here. Thanks, Tracy, and everybody else that organized this. This has been a really exciting conference. I'm quite excited to speak about new frontiers in satellite data. So this is my perspective, kind of being in the industry, but I'm actually an academic historically, so I've got some of that as well. And I'll be very curious to hear if people agree or disagree, and then also a shout out for all the students in the room. I think, and I hope that this will give you some perspective on where I see sort of jobs opening up in the future, right? That's kind of important for everybody. So definitely ask me questions about that as we get into the Q&A or afterwards. So I want to start with something that's a little bit different. So these are two images that come from that big conference in Davos that we always hear about, right? So this is a bunch of money people that like to get together every year in back rooms, cigar filled, probably not anymore, but used to be, and talk about what they see as the big problems around the world. So they do this survey every year. And if we go back to the 90s, the 2000s, it was all about things like the housing market bubble. That's what they were really concerned about. But as we got to the 2010, 11, 12 timeframe, we started to see these people that, again, are not environmental scientists in any way, shape, or form. They're focused on what is going to affect the bottom dollar line of the stakeholders and EBITDA and all those sorts of things. And so last year's report, if you look on the bottom axis, that's the likelihood that they think something's going to happen. And on the sort of the y-axis, that's what they think the impact of that thing is going to be. And I've just shaded in green the environmental things. And so you can see, right, geophysical disasters is there. That's always kind of been there. They're maybe not as concerned about some of that, but things like extreme weather, climate action, failure, human environmental damage, a lot of the stuff that we've actually talked about in some of the other presentations over the last day and a half do show up on this chart. And I think this is important because where there are risks and concerns, money follows. And so I think there's going to be a lot of investment in these things because it's affecting our economies. And I think as scientists, we've known this for a really, really long time, and we're very passionate about it. But having the sort of the money following this as well is going to be quite interesting. And then on the right is a new question they asked this year that says, not today, but in the next 5 to 10 years, what are you most concerned about? And the top 5 things are all environmental things. That's pretty shocking to me. And I think if you would ask me that question 10 years ago, there's no chance I would have said that this is happening, but everybody gets it now. And so I think that's really important for us to remember. So something I like to talk about in terms of all the work that we do at Ball Aerospace, but really the group, everybody here, I think will agree with this, is you can't manage what you don't measure. And I think that's going to be my tagline for where all these industries are going moving forward as we get better technology in all kinds of different ways. We're starting to be able to look at addressing these top global problems that all of these investment guys see and come up with better data, which is going to drive all of these solutions. So the next couple of slides, I just want to talk specifically about different parts of the world that I see changing. And so first of all, is some of the new frontiers in tech. I want to go back to I think it was the first or second presentation yesterday where we saw the first image from a weather satellite, and it was kind of grainy and black and white, but it was really cool back at the time. And now look at us today, right? We have way better spatial resolution. Those first satellites were basically pictures like we would take on our camera, but now we have all kinds of things in the visible spectrum, IR, we have microwave. If we're doing space stuff, we do X-rays as well, right? It's pretty cool. So we've got that, all 3 of these things improved spatial, temporal, and spectral. Okay, so the spatial is really, it's pretty obvious. We're getting an ability to look at certainly wellheads, right? And so Angel's presentation was really nice yesterday where we started to look and you could see, aha, that's that specific well, because that's a 30-meter resolution that he was getting at. Couldn't have done that 10 years ago. The temporal resolution, I think the best example that I'm thinking of comes to the air quality side, where for the Koreans, they have this satellite called GEMS, and it takes a snapshot every hour of the air quality over, say, the China, Korean, Japanese peninsula. So historically, we've had our low Earth orbit satellites that are getting an image maybe once a day. Now we're getting it once an hour. So as a scientist, I can start to think, wow, what are the things I can unlock with that? And as we move to next generation GOES, satellites, and other kinds of solutions with constellations, that temporal resolution aspect is just giving us data to answer questions in ways that we couldn't even ask before. So I think that's coming. And the spectral resolution part of it gets us to the multispectral, the hyperspectral, where we're now looking at, say, so from an NDVI perspective, it's been around forever, it's good. But what if we could carve up the spectra even finer, right? That's opening, again, new avenues of research that all these end users really want. They don't necessarily know that it's available. So that's an interesting gap that I think the science community has to focus on with end users, is we hear a lot about what end user concerns are, and then historically we would go and try and come up with solutions for it. But now I think the tech is driving some of the capabilities in ways that we have to approach the end user and say, did you know you could do this? And then see where those kind of discussions will lead us. So I think there's some changes coming in the market in terms of the providers as well. So again, historically, if we go back, NASA builds all the satellites. The aerospace companies in the US were heavily involved in that sort of thing. But over the last, say, decade or two, we're really starting to see the development of US startups and international ones as well. And so that's kind of the first two parts of it. But I will say that, especially in the last year, we've started to see some real uncertainty in the investment world about how we're going to be funding all these startups. There hasn't been a lot of exits. And if you're familiar with this term called a SPAC, it was super hot a couple years ago. And now we've seen a lot of those companies that did SPACs, their stock price has been cratering. So what does that mean for the long-term viability of that kind of funding mechanism and that kind of company? I don't think anybody really knows, but it's going to be quite interesting to watch. Related to that, of course, is VCs. There's a lot of money in the VC world. They've been pumping it into our markets for a long time. That's probably going to continue, but we'll see how that goes with interest. And then NGOs is, I think, particularly a new one that we need to pay attention to. And MethaneSat being a great example, where EDF is the first NGO to actually fund development of a satellite. Is that a one-off, or will that continue with other NGOs around the world? I can tell you there's a lot of interest from other NGOs, but again, it's not cheap to launch a satellite, right? So we'll see how that kind of goes. And then I think the last thing in the market that I see for providers is, will there be consolidation? There's a lot of players out there right now that build widgets, other ones that bring payloads together. There's spacecraft companies. There are data analytics companies. There's a few groups that do more than one, Ball being one of them. But I wonder, and when I look at other markets, historically, there tends to be some consolidation at some point in the markets because there's just too many providers to solve these problems. So I think that's probably going to happen as well. But who are the winners going to be? That's probably pretty unknown at this point. And then in terms of the customers, I think this is going to be quite interesting as well. My feeling is we're going to see a lot of continued growth in data sales to the US government. So NOAA, NASA, various other agencies are thinking about this idea and actually doing this idea of commercial data buys, where they say, historically, I'm going to go and contract with company X, they're going to build me a satellite, we're going to get data from it, we're going to release it to the scientific community. But now they're also saying, okay, so company Y has a satellite up there already, why don't I just buy some data from them and we can immediately turn that over to the various communities. So that model probably continues for sure. Also, I think there'll be foreign market opportunities for all of us that continue. And this is sure the big European players, the big Asian players, but also if you take a look, just go on Wikipedia sometime and look at nations that have space agencies, you'll see that a lot of the countries that historically have not been in space are starting to get into space. They've got interesting problems of their own. And I think that is just going to kind of continue to develop. Very valuable for the conference today is this idea of niche markets. And again, I think historically we launch a satellite and it tries to do all kinds of stuff because it's pretty expensive and hard to do. But we're starting to get definitely more into the MethaneSat, GHGSat, all these companies that are focused on a specific, what I'll call a niche market. Niche doesn't mean small, but it just means a sort of dedicated type of application and we'll see more and more of those as we go on. Another one that I see developing is plastics in the ocean, right? So the UN met this past February and said 3 years from now, we're going to have a legally binding treaty around plastics control. So now the scientific community is saying, well, how do we measure plastics? Because if you don't have a baseline, then there's no way you can actually measure or monitor anything long term, right? So that's a new market that I think is coming. There's going to be a lot of other ones that that weren't here 10 years ago. If we tried, Tracy, if you tried to have this conference 10 years ago, I'm not sure you'd have that many people in the room, right? And so 10 years from now, there'll be a conference on something that none of us are probably thinking of right now. And from the students' perspective, that's where one of my big things I would say is keep an open mind and keep seeing where the new nuggets are starting to form, because there's no icons in those new markets, right? So there's great opportunities for you. And that leads to the new problems as well. I think I mentioned this a little bit, but until recently, we really couldn't do GHG asset attribution because the data was not at the right quality. And I think it was Megan, maybe, but I'm not sure who said it, said that if you had the wrong resolution, you can get the wrong answer, right? And that's a really good point that I think a lot of companies try to sell too much, perhaps, in terms of capability. We should all keep that kind of in mind. So bottom line, though, I think the future is really bright, and there's going to be a tremendous amount of opportunity to find your passion, follow that, and make a nice career out of it. And at the same time, make a really impactful difference for the world. So that's what I got to say. So Paul, I'll turn it over to you.
A wonderful setup for my talk. So I have the fortune of sitting in systems and software engineering division at Stevens. So I think about not what we have currently, but what do we want to have in the future in terms of systems and capabilities. And I want to share with you today a little bit about my thoughts about reimagining what our space observation systems could look like, including leveraging some new technology that's becoming available both from government and commercial agencies. So I work closely with NASA's Earth Science Technology Office within the Earth Science Division. And how most of the presentations start is a visualization of the fleet of spacecraft that help to observe the Earth. And it's really an amazing composition of spacecraft, some of which have been operating for 15 plus years, some of which have cost more than $1 billion when you count the total life cycle costs. But we also have very strong collaboration between NASA and other government agencies and international partners to operate these missions. Some of the spacecraft are large monolithic spacecraft. We have some new constellation style missions that are exploring higher temporal revisit. There's CubeSats that have been launched from the International Space Station. It's really an awesome mix of capabilities. What gets me excited, though, is not just what the government is doing in space, but the broader space industry, which has changed significantly over the last 10 to 20 years. We have the emergence not only of different foreign space programs, which have been helping contribute to knowledge about our Earth system, but there are a number of commercial firms that provide services to supplement data available from government sources. So companies like Maxar, Planet, Spire, Capella, they're providing imagery and data as a service, both for scientific research projects, but also for business intelligence. We also have building on the foundation of what I would say is the first wave of space-based internet or space-based communication from the Iridium and Globalstar constellations, a new significant interest in building mega constellations in low Earth orbit to provide commercial data connectivity. Organizations like OneWeb, Starlink, and even Amazon through their Kuiper constellation proposed and their ground service networks are really changing the way that we think about connectivity, both between communities on the ground and connectivity with missions that are operating in space. So it's this composite patchwork of all of the different players that really makes working in space an exciting time right now. So the primary program that I've been working on over the last couple of years within the Earth Science Technology Office is called the New Observing Strategies Thrust. New Observing Strategies looks at ways of interconnecting sources and services in new ways using information technology. So imagine being able to dynamically couple operations of large satellites, small satellites, but also in situ sources of data from stream gauge sensors, ocean buoys, and other Earth observing networks. This sort of interconnectivity, which is still in the relatively early stages in operational use, has the potential to dramatically change the types and data that we collect from space to help address Earth science problems. When we're thinking about designing a new observing system, there are a lot of questions in terms of design that come to mind. Should it be designed as a monolithic system with a single observing asset? Or should it be more distributed, for example, taking advantage of a sensor network or a constellation of satellites? Should it have centralized control by a single organization or agency? Or should there be more of a federated approach where there's a coalition of partners working together through a contractual agreement to further common or shared objectives? To what degree do we use space-based assets versus supplementing with airborne and ground or in situ based platforms? And how can we use existing assets, and when do we need to consider and develop new assets to help fill in the gaps of observing systems? So these are some of the questions that I work with my science stakeholders on almost a daily basis to help understand, to propose new observing systems that could meet some of the needs for scientific and other objectives. When you think of a new observing system as an interconnected network of information sources, you can kind of imagine the observing system as really a computer network. It's just that some of the computers happen to be flying in space and you may not be able to communicate with them all the time. So additional issues from a technical perspective that come up when viewing observing systems as distributed information processing networks include issues like, how do you secure communication protocols, especially when you're crossing organization boundaries? How do you improve automation of observing systems, which may include, for example, improving the computational processing ability on orbit? How do you improve the information quality that's being collected by the observing systems to meet the data quality standards of different partnering organizations? How do you set the pricing for services, particularly commercial services? How do you schedule tasks that have been requested by clients or customers? And how do you prioritize those tasks based on possibly non-financial criteria? How do you work to standardize data interfaces to allow for greater interoperability of information across organization boundaries? And how do you assimilate these heterogeneous sources of data that may be on multiple spatial scales, temporal scales, and spectral dimensions into a common modeling framework to help understand the implications of this data? I argue that a lot of these issues start to move beyond a traditional aerospace or electrical engineering domain and really focus on some of the information system challenges that are more broadly observed within our society. So in my group, I've been working very closely again with NASA's Earth Science Technology Office to help understand what are the objectives and needs of stakeholders who are looking to use space-based data and help to envision what future observing systems could look like. One of the tools that we have developed in my group is called the Trade Space Analysis Tool for Constellations that helps to model the spatial coverage of constellation-style missions, and specifically when considering heterogeneous spacecraft with different sensor geometries. By working with this set of software tools, we can use historical data sets like the GEOS-5 data set or the MERA-2 reanalysis to see what observations could have been possible if we had a different set of observing assets than what were in the historical record. And we can start to build an argument for what types of technology should be invested in the future. So with this little bit of a taste of what I've been doing in my group, I'm looking forward to the questions from the community and for the panel responses to help think about what the future of space data for energy policy could look like. Thank you.
Okay, I think one question that that I've been thinking about through this whole conference is, where are the unmet needs? And I guess I would welcome each of you to weigh in on this question of where are the gaps where there's a solution in sight. And if you whether it's your own idea or something you've heard in the talks or discussion today, that would be great. And I guess also then how can we meet the need?
kick off because I'm on the closest to you here. One thing that we find is that we're constantly looking for more frequent, more granular visual data. However, the more we think about it, like in a perfect world, we would have visual data that we could collect on a weekly basis that would be down to the sub-meter type fidelity. And with that, there's a million insights we could get into what's going on in the areas that we operate or are interested in. However, if you step back and say, well, now I have this data, processing it and trying to figure out what it actually is telling you becomes the challenge, because there just aren't enough, sort of eyes that we can put on it in a cost-effective way to get value out of it. So then it's like, which do you get first? Do you get the satellite with the frequency and the granularity, or do you get the data processing and algorithms to tell you what that's saying? And that becomes the ultimate challenge. So I see, one begets the other, but it's a challenge that we know what we want, but we don't know what we do with it if we got it.
Yeah, I mean, I think to kind of build on that, right? To me, it's a temporal part of it, because we see with all the low Earth orbiting satellites, snippets of information that's really cool. And it's prompting a lot of people I talk to say, it's nice, well, it's sort of a Landsat, right? Once every 14, 16 days, whatever, as long as it's not body. What if we could do that every hour, right? Like, what would that do? And to your point, we probably don't exactly know how to use some of that data, but I think it's going to, scientists are very clever. They're going to figure it out once that data for sure is out there. So to me, it's the temporal part of it.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. So I've been working with some hydrologists who've been very eager to get hands on high spatial resolution data about flooded areas. And we've been working with commercial imagery providers and performing surface water extent post-analysis of imagery data. The challenge, and the imagery and the data products have actually been wonderful. The challenge has been, how does that high spatial resolution data get integrated into the existing forecasting models that are used by the scientific community? We're still kind of lockstep on a new forecast run being kicked off on a supercomputing cluster every 12 hours or 24 hours. So we're not really taking advantage of some of the low data latency opportunities from the dynamic tasking capabilities on board the commercial providers. So there's a definite need for, I would say, improving the automation of the data analysis pipelines on the ground, and almost a fundamental change of thought about how the data processing pipelines on the ground work, rather than in a lockstep routine, to something that's more dynamic and adaptive to the presence and availability of new information. So that's something that's going to take a longer time to resolve, I think, within the community, because it's a pretty big shift in terms of thinking.
Okay.
So a question that kind of builds on that. So Paul, you started showing how you're using analyses to look at hypothetical constellations. And I think what you're talking about now is, how do we start moving? So NOAA and NASA are already doing Earth observing system experiments where you basically take a synthetic atmosphere, like an analysis, you extract a hypothetical satellite measurement from it, and you look at its impact in the system. So, and they're doing that for weather, because that's the main focus. They're beginning to think about doing it for maybe composition, but they're not doing it from an energy impact or energy information kind of perspective. So it seems like we should be doing that. And I guess I would say that, to your latter point, we are doing hourly forecast cycles, as part of the high resolution rapid refresh. That's the kind of place where, and they're actually very involved in energy forecasting. So it seems like there's opportunities there. And also, if you think about the traditional meteorological community, there always has been, for a very long time, a targeted observation program, right? where you send, aircraft out to sample a particular area. I think we need to be thinking about that as a model for now. How do we monitor gas flares and things like that? And again, get this very dynamic data into the model so we can kind of consolidate it. Maybe comments from the panel. And I want to personally thank Paul for building the GeoTasso instrument, which was a precursor for Tempo and GEMS. The science we've gotten out of GeoTasso is absolutely amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, I certainly acknowledge that, and depending on the domain, the timescales of which the forecasts are done differ significantly. It's tied primarily to the timescale of the phenomena of interest. So of course, for hourly forecasts, that's rapid enough where it makes sense to assimilate the newly acquired data products. For your second point, I think that you're exactly right that there's a huge opportunity to have a method or a mechanism to help identify what is the missing observation that would either reduce uncertainty to the greatest amount or provide the greatest additional benefit for the use case, the domain specific use case. I don't know enough about how the area campaigns are scheduled presently, but I would suspect that they're probably not ready to roll on an hour, on a short notice, an hourly notice. But that could be something that would be of interest to explore, similar to how you could issue tasking requests from commercial spacecraft. What if you were able to obtain an additional missing data point from a commercial airborne sensor, maybe even a UAV or drone style campaign? That sort of a service I think would be quite interesting to explore, and it really leverages some of the strengths of airborne to collect high resolution data, very proximate to a location of interest, assuming that it's within range of a launching site.
Yeah, maybe one other thing to take a slight tangent on that. I think the weather community can teach all these other communities some really cool things as well in terms of how to use temporal data, because we've been doing that for a long time. But also, as we see this continuing growth of the private sector, the weather community has dealt with that already, right? If you think back to the early 2000s, there were certainly issues between NOAA and a lot of private companies, and Senator Santorum put that bill to abolish the Weather Service. It got a little heated. The Academy's put out a report on how the public, the Fair Weather Report, how the public and private sectors should work together. It's a great roadmap for everybody else to try and follow, so that when we're talking about energy or air quality or health or ag, that we don't fall into some of those same traps, right? So that's a good addition too.
Guess I would add on maybe a little bit to your point, but the power of satellites is its ability to scale proof of concept globally very quickly with coverage, and that again creates challenges. But I think that's a huge opportunity that this technology can actually provide.
I'm Scott here in Madison as a consultant. Do you use machine learning in your review of satellite data? And do students get trained in this area, or maybe they are, I'm not sure, or should they? And for BP, what % of world oil consumption goes into plastics?
So I would have to consult. BP publishes the global oil forecast every spring, and my gut tells me it's somewhere about 5%. But
I have been impressed and really like the BP statistical world energy thing every year.
So I would consult that for the actual number. I think it's about 5% if I had to be, throw a number out there right now. But as far as what we see in students and machine learning, I think that was your question there, and how we use it. So we do use machine learning in a lot of our models, though I would say that we're pretty sophomoric in what we do versus what's out there when it comes to interpreting satellite data. But some of our other models that we use within the trading organization do do integrate that. You also asked a question about like students and what they learn, and I would say, you know, Paul's slide up there where it had Jupyter and Python and all of that, if we're actually going to get use out of this data, it has to be in an advanced programming platform. There's just too many data points. It's too frequent. It requires too much analysis to be done in anything other than something like that. So for all the students out there, if you're not well-versed in that, take the opportunity. I don't know what you see in your consulting with what you are able to hire and all of that. But,
I'm learning Python and that concept, so it's a knowledgeable question, but I'm not doing it myself.
yeah. I don't know if you guys have anything to add to that as far as data analysis.
Just one interesting piece. There's a lot of interest right now in using machine learning or artificial intelligence to improve the spacecraft operations. So putting AI or ML into the operating system on a spacecraft. But it's a lot trickier than it sounds, because spacecraft have to go through very rigorous verification, validation activities to certify their operation in the extreme environment of space. And if you have software that changes its behavior over time, it really can't be verified on the ground. And right now, the systems engineering discipline doesn't have a really good approach. This is an open research question in the broader domain of systems engineering. Is how do you verify the behavior of something that changes over time? So there have been some technology demonstrations on the ISS of using GPU accelerated computation. There's certainly a potential to use these advanced statistical learning techniques in operations to help improve the targeting of the spacecraft, but there's a lot more research that needs to be done to get comfort with those new technologies.
Yes, you need a base data set that's been verified to test the model, to test on the model. So yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, nothing really to add. I think they covered it really well.
I think there was a question over there, Morgan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the fantastic talks. I wanted to come back to a theme that many of you talked about and we've been talking about throughout this conference, and that's thinking about different stakeholder groups. So we discussed in the morning session in particular thinking about questions of energy justice, and there are many stakeholder groups that right now are under-engaged in this process for various reasons. And so I'm wondering how we think about, many of these groups may not even self-identify. Perhaps they know that they're relevant to energy systems, but they might not self-identify as kind of having a stake in satellite data. So how do we identify those stakeholders, and how do we productively bring them into the conversation, particularly when we're thinking about kind of planning for the future? And are there any historical examples in the past where some of these stakeholders have been identified and brought in a productive way?
Maybe I'll go first since I didn't say much last time. So I think there's multiple ways to do it, right? So the academic community certainly has a role to play because they're kind of on the cutting edge of trying to find interesting science problems. And a good way to do that is to go to talk to these stakeholders for sure. Some of the sort of startup companies, the data analytics companies they have a vested interest in finding new customers. That's a great way to do that, right? Sort of talk to some of these other folks. But say from the pure satellite builder perspective that we have, I'm not sure we have as much of a role there. We're a little bit more focused on driving the technology to create the solutions, but we rely a lot on scientific partners, other companies that are kind of on the bleeding edge to sort of tell us where the use of that kind of data is. Second part of your question, I think actually bringing them to places like this would be fantastic, right? Because it would be a great learning exchange both ways, trying to figure things out. And a specific example I know of on kind of the renewable energy side, I used to work at NCAR, and we did a project with tribal leaders, I think it was in New Mexico, where we focused both on how could they better use and site renewable, basically solar panels, right? But it was providing a kind of weather forecast for knowing how much energy they were going to get from the panels so that they would know how much other kind of energy they'd have to bring in. And there was an associated project around health and mosquitoes and dengue fever and stuff like that, right, too. So that was kind of a really cool, eye-opening project to work with a community that clearly we hadn't really worked with in the past.
I guess I would sort of come at it from two approaches. One is the question of whether it's satellites is, I think, it can easily be a satellite technology that's underpinning what you're trying to get to these communities. But really what you're trying to do is help people understand what the energy system is, what the impact of their decisions is, and whether it's satellites or something else. I don't think the community, they should be sort of indifferent to that. So it's about coming up with what is the solution and then finding the best technology to get that across. I think many of us in this room can imagine how satellites are that technology, but it's, I think, up for all of us and all of our peers to try and communicate that to people. As and I maybe weather is the perfect example. If you go back into the 60s, no one would have imagined the value that they get from their satellite image on the weather forecast at night. Now, none of us could imagine watching the evening news and not seeing that. So.
And actually, maybe I'll just sort of weigh in on this too, because when we were designing this conference and thinking about, satellite, is satellite data for energy analysis and policy the right lens? And everybody agreed that the energy analysis and policy was a good lens because this is hosted by the analysis and policy graduate certificate program. But, well, why satellites? Why not other sources of data? Why not models? Why not drones? And the truth is, as soon as you start growing, it becomes an everything conference. And if you start saying like all data for all energy, there's no way like that. If you try to do everything, then you end up doing nothing. So we decided to start with satellite data, but I think, just on the stakeholder engagement thing too, and this will maybe lead into my next question back to the group. For 10 years, I've been involved in a NASA stakeholder engagement and applied research initiative called the NASA Health and Air Quality Applied Sciences Team, this weird acronym of HACAST. And if you're interested in health and air quality, we are having a meeting here in Madison in 2 weeks. But we meet actually about every 6 months all around the United States. And we've been building up and building up and building up for 10 years, a community of users where now our mailing list is well over 1,000. But these stakeholder engagement activities are mainly focused on public sector users and public sector data providers, whether that's the EPA or state agencies, cities, nonprofits, World Health Organizations, researchers. They're people who are used to having free data. And HACAST is funded by NASA, which is in the business of providing free data. So it all fits together. But I've been really thinking throughout this 2-day meeting about ways to move forward on these energy discussions. And one of the most complicated nuggets or pieces of the puzzle is, where does the public interest, data, resources, and users, including nonprofits and federal agencies, and actually FERC is having a meeting this same week, otherwise we would have had folks here from FERC or MISO or those stakeholders as well. How do those interests interface with private sector stakeholders, and whether that's large companies like BP or startup companies like we've heard from Satellitic and Scenario earlier this week, or even traders. And I know, Ben, you do trading at BP. I gotta say, like, my eyes have been opened as to how important trading data is for traders, because whether you're an investment company or an energy company or a startup company, the role of financial trading, they run on data, staying one step ahead, but they don't necessarily want data that everybody knows. They want data that only they know. And so I guess the sort of question to all of you is, how does the data offerings and the data needs, how should we be thinking about that in this complex energy space where there are so many private and public needs, information needs?
We all turned to Paul.
I got that one. So energy is it's such an all-encompassing topic. It's a driver of changes to the environment. It's an enabler for industry. Provides us comfort in our day-to-day life. There's certainly dramatic public benefits associated with information about energy use. That I think that there's a strong role to play for the government, either directly or indirectly through commercial data buys, of being able to provide information which would be objective in nature about the Earth system that we live in. I think that it's difficult probably to give. So we heard a little bit about some of the potential challenges in funding some of the startups that have emerged. I think it's difficult to give a concrete return on investment number for some of the benefits of information for energy policy. And I think that what that calls for then is that there's a persistent need for public access to data, for public provision data, to supplement the other application cases where there may be a more clear return on investment that can be computed to inform investment decisions. And I'll point to, I guess, one example. I find the historical example of the Landsat imagery really interesting. When Landsat was first developed, the imagery was actually sold. It was priced below cost, but still pretty expensive, of hundreds of dollars per image. And that was changed in the 90s to make the Landsat imagery publicly available. And estimates of the societal benefit of that open data set were tens to hundreds of times of what the financial revenues of the original data set was. So I think that there's huge untapped opportunities for use of data sets in ways that can't even be imagined. And we won't know what the applications of the data are, especially data with long historical records, until we see it. So yeah, so I think that there's a huge call for public benefit, public value for space-based data, and it doesn't compete with other applications of satellite data as well.
I mean, a couple things to build on, right? I think the weather community is another good example of where we could go here, where there is NOAA provides free data for everybody, and for a lot of people that's good enough, right? That's what we see on our weather forecast and stuff. Now there are certain companies out there that need better information. Maybe they're a rock concert that's outdoors. They don't go to NOAA for that information, right? For know things, they go to a private company so that they get a bespoke solution that's based on the public data, but some other kind of add-on that the private sector provides. That could be an interesting way that this community could also kind of develop. And then how do we develop some of those things? Being a former academic, right, I'm a big fan of the capstone kind of approach, or hiring graduate students to do things. And I think that's it's something, I don't know if BP does any of that kind of stuff, right? But I imagine that could be a model moving forward to where the research, there's always issues of IP, right? I get it. But still, that's a way to perhaps engage the various sectors to do some really cool stuff.
I think that's sort of spot on, is that, having a data set that everyone can access, and then taking people with a bespoke interest is really where you're going to create it. Because, to be honest, 3-4 years ago, I didn't know how we could use some of the satellite data we use today. One, because I didn't know it existed, and two, I didn't necessarily think about how I could translate that into how we're utilizing it today. And so it's a bit of having, sometimes it's graduate students, or sometimes someone who's industry expert partnered with a, sort of industry expert in the technology versus an industry expert in the market. And merging those two is really where you can get benefit. And from a policy perspective, sometimes that's going to be to generate policy. Sometimes it's going to be to improve business operations. And sometimes there's a marriage of the two, which I think was demonstrated in some of the cost savings that Sean was talking about in the Duke example. Really, that's the beautiful marriage, where you're both doing something that's good for the environment, good for energy policy, but also good business sense.
Brad, before I do, I want to say, are there any? Yeah. And
Thanks. So earlier in the panel, you touched on the challenges of harnessing these increasingly big satellite data sets. It's going to get worse as the constellations continue to expand. I just wondered if you could speak on any particular problems, computation or machine learning or data science, for example, that come to mind as examples of that we could think about more.
I sort of go back to the example I had earlier, just around visual analysis. Again, if you're trying to look at, say, operations of a facility or operations around, somewhere where you can see end user demand. So people sometimes will try and count cars in parking lots, things like that. That might be an easier example than when you're in like a refinery where you have lots of sort of potential for false positives when it comes to operations. But it's really just around the magnitude of the data and trying to process visual imagery, or trying to find a substitute for visual imagery that you can use to give you a signal, whether it's thermal or something like that.
I guess I would add, there's two things that I kind of worry about. One is, as we get to better and better capabilities, right, more data, we have to get it from the satellite down to the ground. And so the comms part of it is often a roadblock to doing really cool stuff today. We're working on it with laser comms and stuff, but it's not really a solved problem yet. And the other thing in the back of my mind that I worry about sometimes is the idea of anti-satellite technologies, right? If there are countries that are not getting along with other countries and they don't want to be imaged, there are things they can do about it, right? Nobody's done it yet, but it's, space is the ultimate high ground. You can get to denied territories, but someday somebody may decide they don't like that anymore. That's going to be a problem.
any other questions from the back? Jennifer is, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sure. I'll just mention quickly. So when you're working with the large satellite data sets, probably the most unintuitive feature for my students is just the magnitude of the data that you're working with. You can't touch the data directly. So what that means is you have to use information environments that allow you to query data sets, pull it dynamically, process it online, look on like MapReduce algorithms. It's a very different mode of computing than what students would be trained in, for example, in a bachelor's degree program. So I think there's been some really amazing tools. I know that Paul Stackhouse's group will be getting the tutorial on power after the session. There's some really great work that NASA's been doing on new information platforms. He's been using, as well as I, the Science Managed Cloud environment, which is a portion of Amazon Web Services that's carved out and supervised by NASA security controls. And it's allowed us to get into the 21st century, which was difficult to do before having that common playing ground for information systems.
Any other questions from the back? Clear, thank you.
Thank you everyone, and through all the days yesterday, it was great exchange here. And
Here's the microphone. It's for the recording.
I'm coming new into this realm of energy, but as I'm hearing through the 2 days and coming back to some of the questions that Martin and Tracy were asking about connecting the information that's available and to the people that don't know that it's available. And so my question to the industry is, through your corporate social responsibility hats or something, can you think of creative ways to help us accelerate this process? Now, so I come from NASA and work with Paul on the power project, and overall, NASA has a very strong applied sciences program. We fund lots of projects to do things. For example, we just heard from Paul that you want to know what the flood inundation is. Now, You can use a combination of satellite with the resolutions that are available and the hydrologic model to do a decent 3-day forecast. And we've done that for the Pakistan floods very recently. We've done that in, Thailand very recently. So there are real world applications where governments and policymakers are able to actually use it. But the barrier is that maybe the other side of the table doesn't know that this is happening. And the research community probably is well versed. And how do we get this information out, right? You're making, for example, all these satellite instruments. Can you partner to create a little program that the instruments that you create are being used somewhere, and let's get it through all the channels in your forums, in your stakeholders? Can we imagine something like that? So I'm saying this, but I want to hear from you. There may be better ways to get the word out there and to communicate that even with the existing technology, maybe everybody doesn't need that kind of resolution or that time. There are uncertainties, but within those bounds, you should be okay to use it in a decision. And we have examples where we've used it. But how do we get this to your community or to the stakeholders that don't know that this is happening?
I guess I would sort of highlight what Tracy said, which is this is the first of what could be multiple conferences, and it feels like what you just described is an entire collection of individuals talking about exactly that for a couple of days, because I don't, I can't answer it, but I think a group of people in a room or in a forum could actually move that forward over a couple of days.
Yeah, maybe one thing I could add too is, or two things. One, there's a whole group of science educators out there, right? We should talk to them more to see how they get their messages out. And I would encourage everybody in this room to give public talks at libraries, try to get on TEDx, those sorts of things, right? Those are great ways to, who knows who you're going to reach, but probably reach somebody, right? So it's a little bit of a targeted thing with the science educators, and maybe a little bit more of a mass broadcast, fishing expeditions. Here we get in.
I'll mention that this is a very important topic. It's been highlighted by White House Science Policy Strategy, which was released in December. Just recently, under the CHIPS Act, federal agencies have been directed to give additional funding for science outreach. So those of us who are PIs on NSF projects received an email a few weeks ago about a space supplement for it directly improving access to space technology and space data from educational perspectives. So there's the next couple of years, I think, are going to be really exciting to accelerate on the gains that we've made over the last decade in space technology. And there's huge opportunities especially for young people who are looking to start their careers.
Yeah, and I'll just maybe add on to this conversation, because what we found through the last decade of work on health and air quality is that it requires a lot of listening and recognizing that a user may have zero interest in satellite data at all. And that is totally okay. So then the question is, well, what kind of data do you use? And what would be on your wish list for information? And it may be that if there's 5 things on their wish list, none of them can be supported by satellite data. And that is okay, because one of the most important things to do is to not sell a specific product. You can't say that this tool is right for everything, because otherwise people will very quickly put up their walls and not be interested. So, but actually, if you get a long enough list of what a potential user might possibly want, then there may start to be a place where you can plug in. And I think what we found, from the perspective of the data providers, is that sometimes a user will say, hey, can we do A? And then the answer will be like, no, I'm sorry, it doesn't work. Or then they might say, well, what about B? And we might say, yes, that's a great application. Go to this website, download the data, boom, boom. And then other times they'll say C. And then C is actually where the juicy bits are, because then that's a question like, well, that's never been done before, but maybe it could be done. And then that becomes an applied research project. So I think just realizing that, like, there is this sort of, I think, feeling that I have come to see from many of the atmospheric science and NASA folks over the years, of which I am one of them, where it's this feeling like if you build it, they will come. If your website is nice enough, surely you will have 1,000 different users. And that is not true at all. Really, it has to be responsive to the user. And one of the conversations I had yesterday at lunch was with a startup company. And I said, well, how much of your work is anticipating what a user might want versus responding to what you've actually already been requested to do? And they said it is 100% responding to an explicit request that has already come in. And I think that's sort of where it's a different paradigm. And if we want to be supporting users, we have to be listening and responding more than trying to like come up with what we think would make a nice website, in my opinion. Brad had a question.
This one's kind of addressed to Ben. So Federal Trade Commission is, I think there's discussions about folding environmental impact and climate change mitigation into kind of the portfolio of risk, right? I don't think that's affecting you on a trading basis, but how is BP thinking about longer term, how it's going to transition to this zero carbon economy and the associated risk that introduced, in terms of a trading company.
Yeah, so obviously a lot to that. So we as a company have committed to being net zero by 2050 or sooner, which is actually not very long. So 28 years from now is actually quite quick. We've made some major investments in green technology, whether it's offshore wind, solar, you name it. From a trading perspective, what we've actually, we have a low carbon trading team. And if you think about the sort of market in general, having a market for lower carbon emission things or credits like that is one way to jumpstart that. I mean, if you think about the sort of Clean Air Act and the trading you had around coal emissions, like that actually helped us sort of move the ball forward there. So I think from a trading perspective, the markets have begun and we're active participants in that. From a risk perspective, I think it all comes down to just complying with whatever regulations come into place and sort of being ahead of the game. No one's telling us to be net zero. We see it as the right move, right?
Maybe I'll claim the last few minutes of the session just to wrap up. Thank you to our speakers once again. It's really been great.